Picture Florence before it became a postcard. It's early, the streets still cool, and the Arno River looks almost harmless. Merchants are already moving. Wool bales, bolts of cloth, spices that smell expensive from a mile away. Above it all, the city is building upward, literally. Stone by stone, the dome of San Maria del Fiore is rising like a public announcement. We are going places. And in a place like this, going places costs money. Not coins in a pouch, money, serious money. The kind that has to travel across borders, survive storms, survive thieves, survive politics, and still arrive on time. Now here's the twist. Most people think the Medici story is a story about power grabbing. A rich family buys influence, pulls strings, becomes untouchable. And sure, politics matters. But if we start there, we miss the more interesting part. The financial engine that made that influence possible in the first place. Because the Medici didn't just run a bank. They ran a pattern. And it's a pattern that shows up again and again in finance. Even when nobody's wearing velvet robes anymore. If you could stand in Florence in the 1400s and ask a smart merchant, what's the biggest problem in business? You might expect them to say something dramatic like war or plague. But a lot of the time, the answer would be simpler. Distance. Distance between cities. Distance between currencies. Distance between when you pay and when you get paid. Distance between what you know and what you can prove. A trader in Florence wants to buy English wool. Great. But the wool is in England. The seller wants to be paid in a currency they trust, and nobody wants to haul a chest of gold across Europe like a walking invitation to be robbed. Even if you manage it, you've got exchange rates, local fees, and the uncomfortable fact that governments can change rules on a whim. So what do? You don't move the gold. You move trust. This is the world the Medici Bank stepped into. A world where money is less like cash and more like a promise with legs. And if you can become the place that reliably turns promises into reality, you become more valuable than the gold itself. That's why I want you to hold on to one idea as we begin. Banking in the Medici era wasn't mainly about being rich. It was about being the most believable middleman in a city full of ambitious people who needed believable middlemen. And here's where the pattern nobody sees coming starts to form. When people hear bank, they imagine vaults, big doors, piles of coins. But the Medici advantage wasn't just what they had. It was what they knew, who they trusted, and how quickly they could coordinate across space. They built a network, branches and partners in major commercial hubs, so they could do something that looks ordinary now, but was revolutionary then. Make transactions feel local even when they weren't. Need to pay someone far away? The Medici system could often make it feel like you were paying across the street. Need a currency conversion that didn't feel like you were being quietly robbed? Their network gave them pricing power and information. Need a deal done fast? Speed becomes a competitive edge when everyone else is waiting for letters and caravans. And because this was a Christian Europe with strong moral and legal pressure around usury, banks had to be clever about how they got paid. The Medici didn't simply slap interest on everything and call it a day. They worked through exchange transactions, fees, and complex arrangements that let commerce function while staying inside the rules, or at least close enough that powerful people could look away without embarrassment. It's one of those moments in history where you can almost hear the incentives clicking into place. People wanted trade to grow. Leaders wanted tax revenue. The church wanted moral authority. Merchants wanted liquidity. The bank that could satisfy all of them without openly insulting any of them, that bank wins. But winning like this creates a particular kind of tension. Because when your business is trust, the product is invisible. Nobody can see the quality on the shelf. They only see the reputation until the day the reputation slips. So the Medici had to become obsessive about credibility. Who gets credit and who doesn't? Which partners are reliable? Which political relationships are useful and which are radioactive? How much risk is worth taking when the upside is huge and the downside is losing the one thing you're selling? And now we're at the real hook. The Medici Bank didn't become powerful just by lending money. It became powerful by becoming a kind of economic switchboard connecting merchants, cities, currencies, and institutions. And once you become the switchboard, you start seeing the whole room. You see who's solvent, who's bluffing, who's desperate, who's rising. That information doesn't just help you make money. It helps you shape outcomes. But here's the part most people don't expect. The same pattern that builds that kind of power also plants the seeds of fragility. The moment a bank becomes a hub, it faces a pressure that's almost impossible to avoid, expanding to meet demand, leaning on relationships, and taking risks that feel small in isolation until they aren't. So in this story, the rising stakes aren't about one dramatic betrayal. They're about something quieter and more realistic, incentives stacking up, decisions that make sense at the time. The slow shift from we manage risk to we are risk without anyone announcing the change. And if you're thinking, okay, so what exactly is the pattern? Good. That curiosity is the point. Because once you see it in the Medici world, you start noticing it everywhere. And how financial networks grow, how trust is manufactured, how reputations are monetized, and how success can quietly rewrite the rules inside an institution. So let's walk into Florence properly. Not through the legend of a powerful family, but through the financial logic of a bank that learned how to trade in trust, and what that trade eventually demanded in return. So let's step inside the machine. Florence is loud with ambition, but it's also loud with friction. Every city has its own coins, its own weights, its own rules, and its own powerful people who can suddenly reinterpret those rules. Trade is booming, yes, but trade is also constantly bumping into the same problem. You can't do big business if every deal requires dragging metal across mountains. That's why the Medici Bank's real product wasn't a pile of gold. It was a smoother world. They built a network of branches and agents across major trade centers. And that network did something quietly magical. It turned long-distance commerce into something that felt manageable. If you were a merchant, what you wanted wasn't just money. You wanted predictable settlement. You wanted a way to pay someone far away, on time, with minimal drama. You wanted to hedge the fact that currencies moved, politics moved, and ships sometimes didn't arrive at all. The Medici system could reduce those uncertainties. Never eliminate them, but reduce them enough that business could keep breathing. And they could do it because they were doing three things at once. They were moving information faster than most people could. They were pricing risk into exchange and fees. And they were renting out their reputation like a service. Here's what I mean by reputation as a service. In a world with limited auditing, limited standardization, and slow communication, you don't always know if the person you're trading with is solid or slippery. You might have a letter of introduction, maybe a family connection, maybe a guild relationship. But those are imperfect. A bank with a strong name becomes a shortcut. If a respected bank is willing to accept a bill, clear a payment, or vouch for a party through its actions, that is verification. Not perfect verification, but valuable enough that people pay for it. Now, if we zoom in on the mechanics, a lot of Medici-era finance runs on instruments like bills of exchange. Think of them as structured IOUs that help you pay across distance and across currencies. Instead of shipping gold, you arrange a contract that says, I will pay you here in this currency, and my partner will pay your partner there in that currency. The bank stands in the middle, coordinating the promise. So imagine a Florentine cloth merchant needs English wool. He strikes a deal with a supplier connected to London. He could try to send coin, but that's slow and risky. Instead, he walks into a Medici branch and arranges an exchange. He pays in Florence. The paperwork specifies that a related party in London will receive payment in pounds at a set time. The Medici network makes sure that when the supplier's side shows up in London with the right documents, the payment actually happens. Everyone sleeps a little better because the promise is backed by a system that has something to lose if it fails, its name. And notice what the bank earns here. It's not just interest in the simple, modern sense. It's a combination of exchange margin, fees, and the spread between what it receives and what it pays out, shaped by time and risk. In an era where charging explicit interest could be controversial or restricted, exchange transactions created a pathway for banks to earn while keeping deals socially and legally acceptable. Historians debate exactly how different houses balance the letter of religious rules with the economic realities, but the incentive is clear. commerce needed credit, and institutions found ways to supply it without openly picking a fight with the moral order of the day. This is the pattern forming. Once you're the trusted bridge, people route more and more of their trade through you. That concentrates volume. Volume concentrates information. Information improves pricing. Better pricing attracts more volume. It's a flywheel. And there's a second flywheel layered on top: institutional clients. The Medici relationship with the papacy is a famous example. When you handle large institutional flows, taxes, dues, transfers, collections, you don't just earn money. You earn legitimacy. It's like wearing a badge that says the most important people trust us. That reputation then travels ahead of you into other markets. It becomes easier to open doors, attract depositors, and recruit partners. It's not just finance, it's social proof with a balance sheet. But every flywheel has a shadow. Because once a bank becomes a hub, it starts facing a temptation that is both logical and dangerous, stretching the definition of safe to keep growth going. Merchants always want more credit than is comfortable. Big clients want special terms. Branch managers want to hit targets and prove themselves. Political allies want favors that don't look like favors on paper. And a hub bank is surrounded by people who can all make their problems feel urgent. You can almost picture the internal conversations. This is a great client. We can't afford to lose them. This loan will pay off once the shipment comes in. This branch is under pressure, but the market is too important to retreat. This relationship protects us. It's worth the risk. None of those lines sound insane. That's the point. Risk rarely walks in wearing a villain costume. It walks in wearing a business suit and holding a reasonable argument. And because the Medici ran a decentralized network with branches that needed oversight, the bank's health depended on discipline across distance. That is hard even now. And back then communication was slower, record-keeping varied, and local conditions could push managers into decisions headquarters wouldn't love. When a branch makes a risky bet, it might not look catastrophic in the moment. It looks like just one more deal. Now add the most human factor of all. The bank's reputation is intertwined with the family's political and social ambitions. Supporting art, funding projects, building alliances, these weren't random luxuries. They were investments in status and stability. In Florence, status could be protection. Status could be access. Status could be a moat. But status is expensive. And the deeper you tie banking to political positioning, the more your financial decisions can start serving two masters: profitability and power. That's a delicate balancing act. If it stays balanced, you look brilliant. If it tilts, you can end up taking risks that make sense politically but are messy financially. This helps explain why the pattern nobody sees coming isn't simply they were greedy or they were corrupt. The more interesting explanation is that their success produced structural pressures: concentration risk, reputation risk, and governance risk. Those are modern terms, but the logic fits. When too much business depends on a few major relationships, one shock can punch above its weight. When people trust you because they believe you're stable, any hint of instability is extra damaging. When your branches act semi-independently, weak oversight can turn local problems into network problems. And here's where it starts to feel familiar. Most of us don't run Renaissance banks, but we live inside systems built on similar trust rails. You might not ship Florence to London, but you do trust a payroll system to land your salary on time. You trust a payment app to work during an emergency. You trust that your bank balance is real, even though it's mostly a coordinated set of records. You trust that when you swipe a card, a whole invisible orchestra plays in sync behind you. And when it doesn't, even once, doesn't it feel strangely personal? That's the human side of financial networks. The better they work, the more invisible they become, until the day you notice them. So the Medici pattern is this rising arc. Build trust, become the bridge, turn trust into volume, turn volume into influence, and then discover that the very things that made you powerful, scale, connections, reputation, also make you fragile in specific ways. It's like building the tallest tower in the city. The higher it goes, the more impressive it looks. The higher it goes, the more wind it catches. And in the Medici world, the wind wasn't just economics. It was politics, war, shifting trade routes, sovereign borrowers who didn't always behave like polite spreadsheet assumptions, and the reality that sometimes a sure thing is only sure until it isn't. So as the stakes rise, keep asking a simple question. If your main asset is trust, what happens when the world gives people a reason to doubt? Just a little. Because once doubt enters the room, the entire business model changes its mood. And that's the thing about the Medici Bank. It didn't need to conquer Florence with armies. It conquered a much quieter territory first. The space between I owe you and I trust you. When you rewind back to that river city with its wool merchants and crowded workshops, the Medici story stops being a museum piece and starts sounding like a business case. People weren't lining up because the Medici were glamorous. They were lining up because the world was messy. Coins didn't match, distance was dangerous, information was slow, and the cost of being wrong was brutal. The Medici offered something that felt almost supernatural at the time: reliability across chaos. A promise that could travel without a chest of gold. A deal that could happen without everyone having to personally know everyone. A way to turn uncertainty into a fee schedule. And once you see that, the pattern nobody sees coming becomes harder to unsee, because it's not really about the Renaissance. It's about what happens anytime a financial system becomes good at making risk feel smaller than it is. You build a bridge people can walk across. At first, it's a bridge between Florence and London, between one currency and another, between today and a payment next month. People use it because it's useful. Then they use it because everyone else uses it. Then they use it because not using it feels like falling behind. And without anyone announcing it, the bridge becomes the city. That's when the stakes rise. Because when your product is trust, your growth strategy is basically become essential. But being essential is a double-edged compliment. It means you're valuable. It also means you're exposed. The better you are at smoothing commerce, the more commerce runs through you, and the more you start carrying the emotional weight of the whole system. People don't just want you to work. They want you to work even on the worst day of the year, even during conflict, even during panic, even when everyone is suddenly asking the same question at the same time. Is my money safe? That question didn't start in the age of apps. It's ancient. Now, we don't have to pretend the Medici were saints or supervillains. Their banking practices, their politics, the reasons for their long-term decline. Historians debate plenty of the details, and that's fair. But the incentives are clear enough to follow without mythology. A hub bank is rewarded for expanding. It's praised for being connected. It's pulled into relationships with powerful institutions because that's where volume lives. And then it discovers that the same relationships that raise its status can also trap it. Because sometimes the best client is simply the client with the biggest bill you can't afford to collect late. It's a weird feeling, isn't it? How money, which we talk about like it's solid and scientific, is also deeply psychological. It's numbers, but it's also mood. Think about how you personally behave when a payment is delayed. You don't immediately assume the laws of math have collapsed. You assume a system failed. A bank, an app, a network, a person. And your brain goes into story mode. What if this gets worse? What if it's not just me? What if I should move my funds? That's not irrational. That's you reacting to the truth that finance is coordination. It only works smoothly when millions of people agree to keep acting like it works smoothly. And here's the controversial statement I promised you, and I want you to sit with it for a second. Every banking system is, at its core, a confidence engine. Money doesn't live in vaults as much as it lives in shared belief. Now, that sounds spicy, so let me be crystal clear. I'm not saying banks are fake or that finance is a trick. I'm saying the most underappreciated ingredient in finance is trust. Trust that records are accurate. Trust that rules will be enforced. Trust that tomorrow will look enough like today, that contracts still mean what we think they mean. Trust that other people will keep playing the same game by the same rules. That's not a flaw. That's the point. It's actually kind of beautiful when you think about it. We build a system where value can move at the speed of agreement. But it's also why the Medici pattern keeps repeating. If your business is manufacturing trust at scale, You can make the world feel safer than it is. And when the world feels safer, people take bigger risks. Businesses expand. Trade accelerates. Wealth grows. Everyone applauds. Until a shock hits, and the system has to prove whether that feeling of safety was earned or merely rented. That's the moment where you find out whether you build a bridge or a stage set that looked like a bridge from far away. The Medici were early masters of the bridge. They created a network that made commerce smoother, and that is a genuine accomplishment. But being a master bridge builder doesn't make you immune to weather. And a bank doesn't fail only when it's evil. Sometimes it fails because it was successful enough to become fragile in exactly the way success tends to create. Too many dependencies, too much reputation on the line, too much exposure to big relationships that can't be unwound quickly. So when you look back at Florence, don't just picture paintings and politics. Picture the daily grind of incentives. Picture a merchant who wants certainty. Picture a branch manager who wants growth. Picture a powerful institution that wants efficient collections. Picture a family that wants stability and status. Picture a system where every smart move nudges the next move into being. That's the heartbeat of financial history. People responding rationally to incentives, and those responses stacking into outcomes no one fully controls. And here's the most practical takeaway for a finance-minded viewer. Anytime you see a financial institution or system that seems too smooth, ask yourself what it's smoothing over. What risks are being absorbed, transformed, delayed, or simply ignored because the machine is running well? Who gets rewarded when trust expands? Who pays when trust contracts? That's not cynicism. That's literacy. Because once you start noticing the Medici pattern, you stop being surprised by certain rhythms in financial history. Periods of rapid expansion, bursts of innovation, sudden panics, the scramble for liquidity, the dramatic shift from everything is fine to we need clarity right now. These aren't just random crises. They're the emotional physics of a confidence-based system trying to coordinate under stress. Now I want to pull you into the conversation because I think this is one of those topics that hits differently depending on where you've lived, what you've experienced, and what you've seen financial systems do on their best days and worst days. Have you ever had a moment where your trust in a financial system got tested? Maybe a transfer that didn't land when it should have. A bank app that went down at the worst possible time. A surprise fee that made you feel like you were negotiating with invisible rules. Or even the opposite, a moment where a system worked so well it felt like magic and you realized how much of your life depends on that quiet reliability. Drop your story in the comments. Keep it simple, keep it real. I read them, and I'll reach out in the replies so we can compare notes, because the best way to understand finance isn't just charts and jargon. It's collecting human experiences and noticing the patterns underneath. And next time someone mentions the Medici, you'll be able to smile a little. Not because you know a fun Renaissance trivia fact, but because you can see the deeper game. Trust as the real currency, networks as the real power, and fragility as the price of becoming essential. Florence was just the beginning. The pattern is still here. The only question is whether we notice it before the stakes rise again.